Now, Daren, you're a Windows developer.
I am.
I'm a Windows developer. I love the tooling for Windows.
Absolutely. It's continued to evolve and is an awesome experience.
There's a lot of changes coming, and honestly, if you look at the landscape, it can be a little bit confusing on what to use.
Wouldn't it be great if we could speak to somebody who give us some insights?
Oh, yeah, it's going to be great. That's this episode of DevRadio. Hey, and welcome. This is the next episode of DevRadio. I'm Jerry. This is Daren.
Hey.
And we have Daniel Jacobson. Daniel, thanks for being on the show.
Of course, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Now, Daniel, for everybody listening, tell us who you are.
Sure. So I'm a program manager on Visual Studio in Microsoft's developer division. Our customers are pretty much all developers. You've probably seen a lot of what we've been building recently to support developers building any type of application. But I specifically focus on tools for XAML and Windows developers. So my customers are either building WPF, UWP applications. We're providing some tooling for WinForms developers as well, and also looking into aligning more of our tooling with Xamarin and Xamarin Forms developers. So anyone touching XAML pretty much.
Wow. And XAML really spans a lot of things. That's no doubt about it.
Yep.
So now your job just got a lot broader. And WinForms too. Who would have guessed that life has been breathed into WinForms the way it has been? And WPF itself.
Well, it's actually been interesting because I think post-build there's been a alternate way of articulating how these various frameworks work together with the platform. So maybe you could give us kind of that snapshot of how these things work.
The new
Sure. Yeah, if you saw some of the reporting after builds, Kevin Gallo was going around and interviewing and mentioning that in the future, you're not going to build a WPF application or a WinForms application. You're just going to build a Windows application. And really, any developer building applications and experiences that run on Windows should have advantage or should be able to take advantage of everything that Windows has to offer rather than being locked into some platform choice they made at the beginning of their development. And so from a tooling perspective, a lot of what my team is focused on currently is making it really easy for developers of all kinds, building primarily .NET Windows applications to take advantage of everything that Windows has to offer.
So you're going to make everything that Windows has to offer available to every, well, we don't call them platform, every framework that's available.
Sure. I like to think of them as UI frameworks. If you think about the differences, I mean, under the hood, WinForms and WPF and UWP are all applications running on Windows that have different UI technologies.
That's right. That's right. So let's if I could give you a genie in the lamp and you could have anything you wanted delivered right now because you had a backlog that's probably fascinating to look at, what would be the first thing if you could just do it? What would you give?
Oh man, that's challenging. I think focused on developer tooling and productivity. If I could have true end-to-end hot reload experiences, so I can edit all of my UI and C# backend code, that would make me as a developer way more
productive. Because then that would sort of really ramp down the need for that design experience that's trying to replicate all of these things.
I still think there's value in the design experience for initial development, such as like layout creation and kind of rapid prototyping and brainstorming and just getting ideas on effectively the canvas. But I think for really fine-tuning things and actually building up the more realistic-looking application, doing that at runtime is just so much easier because you actually have real data being pulled in rather than trying to generate your sample data, and you have like real runtime operating conditions and all sorts of stuff. So.
Yeah, sure. And you're also not trying to compose together the various presentation technologies that are being layered in, say with XAML islands on WinForms and those types of things.
Yes, those will be challenging at design time for sure.
Yeah.
Yep.
I remember when XAML Edit and Continue was first introduced, it seemed impossible.
It did. It seemed like that there was a lot of challenges to getting that working, but once it was there, it was indispensable.
Yeah, that's right. At first, only a few things worked. Now I don't even know I can list the things that don't work. It's really
it really changed the conversation on design time data, and I think you just mentioned that because in the sort of the WPF world, we were very used to being able to set up just some XML data that would be data bound in a designer and so on and so forth. When we moved over to UWP, we just had the control string basically being presented as opposed to any sort of rich data. But once we had the runtime edit and continue, then we were presenting, as you say, the real data, and it became a living, breathing app.
How do I do design time data? You hit F5.
You saw we recently rebranded edit and continue to be known as hot reload. As new developers approach Windows platforms, that's kind of become the industry standard for referring to tools such as that.
Yeah, the web's world is using hot reload all of the time and so on, so that makes sense. Yes.
Nice. All right, what's new for a XAML developer opening up Visual Studio?
What's new? So if you're building a XAML application, you're either building WPF or UWP or Xamarin Forms. A lot of what we're focused on is tooling to break down the walls between the framework you chose at the beginning of development and what the platform's capable of. So for example, if you have a WPF application you've been working on for years, you now have a pretty vibrant path forwards with .NET Core and Windows 10. You can open that in Visual Studio. You can use the Windows Application Packaging Project to create msix packages for distribution. You can pretty seamlessly configure automatic and behind the scenes updates where it only updates the things that change within the package. So we've really made installation a lot easier, especially on Windows 10. Then you can add a reference to one of the Microsoft Community Toolkit NuGet packages and add in UWP XAML with XAML islands. And then you can add another reference to a contracts NuGet package, which hosts the Windows 10 runtime platform contracts. And instead of installing the big Windows 10 SDK just to get a set of reference assemblies, basically, you now have a really small NuGet package, and then you can use any Windows 10 device API. So if you want to open up the device camera or get geolocation or use Bluetooth APIs or anything like that, that was traditionally pretty difficult to do in a .NET Framework application, you can now do that really easily.
So one of the challenges that used to exist, I know there's a lot. One of the challenges that used to exist was the need for some app identity to be able to leverage some of the WinRT APIs.
Correct.
How's that been addressed as part of this new world?
Yeah, so we've acknowledged that, well, let me take a step back. So in the past, app identity was purely tied to the package context. So if you had an AppX or now an msix package, that had a manifest inside of it, and that contained an app identity. Now we're also enabling app identity outside the package context using what's called the side-by-side manifest to enable a certain set of scenarios. So there will still be some requirements of the package. I think like tiles and toast notifications is one example, because you need those assets and those icons that actually give you meaningful information about the app, so you can't spoof it. But for example, using XAML islands itself, where you need some of that runtime shimming metadata that was typically tied to the package, you can do in the side-by-side manifest. But to actually get that identity is really easy now. In Visual Studio, using the Windows Application Packaging Project, if you can go down the package route, which I recommend, I think it's a great route to go down. It's literally adding a project to your solution and then adding a reference to your application from that project, and that's it.
Magic wiring.
Okay, so some developers may still hear MSIX and not get it.
Yes.
Walk us through just the benefit.
Yeah, so MSIX is essentially an evolution of our former AppX technology. I would call it a superset. So if you had an AppX today and you renamed it .msix, it would be a valid MSIX package. If you did the reverse, that might not be true. It could be true depending on what's changed. But there's essentially additional infrastructure and technology built on top of it. So we have this app installer technology, which is a little bit of an overloaded term. App installer on Windows 10 is an app itself, and that app enables you to essentially double click an MSIX and install it. So rather than having to use those PowerShell scripts or using the add package manager APIs from Windows, you can just double click the app. And then there's also, it's a file extension that includes installation metadata, including where the package was downloaded from, how often it should check for automatic updates, and things like that. So what that enables.
Well, let me interrupt you just for a second, Daniel, and ask you about the store and delivery. So now I have the MSIX, and I know, of course, I can still deliver through the store fully supported. Are there other options that I can deliver in MSIX now where developers can feel comfortable selecting that and not feel like they're locked into a one delivery method?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So with MSIX package and the app installer file, you can host it anywhere. And so one of the demos that I like to do, just primarily because it's really easy, is I create my application package to my desktop, a folder in my desktop. I specify the installation location as that same folder, and then every time I essentially create a new package to my desktop, it'll actually update. So
it's like AppX and Click Once had a baby.
Kind of, yeah. And so, for example, like in a small enterprise, if you had your UNC path, your network share, and you just had like a bunch of utility applications that maybe your IT department uses or something like that, you could just deploy to a UNC network share and not have to worry about spinning up a web server to host this content or anything like that. So it really does support kind of the flexibility that developers would expect from being able to build Windows applications. And then obviously the store is.
I have this option at msix if I'm building a UWP application today. I have this option if I'm building a WPF application, a WinForms application. Those are the three.
I wouldn't tie it to the
console application.
Anything. So I wouldn't tie it to the application itself. It's essentially just a mechanism for deploying and updating binaries on the machine.
Oh, okay.
And so really pretty much any application can be packaged with MSIX.
And it works on Windows 10?
Correct. So MSIX, they're also working on support for Windows 7. They have like a long-running joke because to enable support on Windows 7, you will need to install a utility that knows how to handle all of this MSIX capabilities, and that is itself an MSI, and they call it the last MSI you'll ever need to install on Windows 7.
Yep. Nice. Famous last words.
Tell this guys, they got to hurry and get this done before everybody moves away from Windows 7. You can't wait forever.
Yeah, but the good news is you can actually track some of the progress. So all of this is on GitHub. So like the MSIX packaging tool, pretty much most of what Windows and pretty much all of the developer stuff we're doing in Microsoft is driven by open source and by community. And that's one of the big shifts you probably noticed over the past few years. And we're really taking that to heart, which has been a lot of fun to observe internally.
Have you noticed that XAML developers are giving you a lot more feedback and interacting with your team a lot more?
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know if you saw not too long ago, we did this like Twitch developer day for the Windows community to re-engage with their desktop community. Yep. So one of the things that kind of spawned from that is observing a need to have a more open forum with this community. And so now we're doing monthly .NET community stand-up. So we have a Windows desktop focused community stand-up every single month. We get tons of feedback through the developer community portal and on the WPF and WinUI repositories on GitHub. So it's been a lot of fun. It's been, I think, a really exciting time for XAML developers building Windows applications.
Well, tell us about how .NET 5, what we're doing to the framework, what we're doing to core impacts Windows developers.
Sure. So .NET Core 3 is kind of the beginning of this renaissance for traditional .NET Windows development is what I would call it, meaning WPF and WinForms primarily. And .NET 5 is the next evolution of .NET driven by Core. And so we're calling it 5 because if we called it 4, which would be the next version in .NET Core, it'd be really confusing for all of the .NET framework development and applications out there.
And we'd never find anything on the interwebs.
Correct. Yes. And so you can cognitively think of .NET 5 as .NET Core v Next, but also the convergence of essentially all of the .NET technology we've been building towards. So there will be slight API differences between .NET 5 and .NET Framework 4.8, for example, but primarily driven by things that we wanted to improve, not things that we didn't want to implement for the sake of not implementing our costs. It's really just things that we think might pose security vulnerabilities or may not have been the best way to do things in the past. We want to do better in the future. One example would be like WCF server versus gRPC. Like we're not going to re-implement WCF server in .NET 5. We're mostly advising people to try using gRPC instead. So,
what's the G stand for?
That's such a good question. I don't know the acronym.
You say it's for Google.
But that's a really interesting thing if you think about it. You know, talking about the journey that Microsoft has taken in terms of embracing external solutions that are considered to be best of breed to a certain extent, and resisting that urge to just reinvent the wheel for the sake of it. You know, I mean, I think that's a very refreshing strategy now.
Yeah, and then that's not normal for Microsoft. This is really a new world.
No, it isn't normal. And I think the biggest shift isn't so much that we're doing that because we're like, oh, we need to stop reinventing things. It's more that we need to listen to our customers, and this is what our customers are doing and what our customers want. And so a lot of our decisions are driven by that more so than by the technology itself.
One of the things that I hear from developers, especially around islands, is a confusion that it is a community-driven project, not a Microsoft-driven product. And so they're concerned that if the community loses interest in it, then it's going to go away. But Islands is a mainstream piece of the tooling and development strategy.
And it was easy to do, wasn't it?
I wouldn't say it was easy to do. So I wouldn't say XAML Islands is a community thing. I think that really what it is it's a set of APIs in Windows, in recent versions of Windows 10 in the UI stack. And so right now it's kind of tied to the most recent versions of Windows 10, which is a limiting factor to a lot of developers. But with the WinUI effort and there was a build talk about decoupled presentation platform and the future of the Windows presentation platform. They're essentially taking most of the UI stack out of Windows, and they're enabling it so they can bring it to earlier versions of Windows 10. And so XAML Islands is one of those pieces that could also conceivably work on earlier versions of Windows 10. And so pretty much as developers start breathing new life into their .NET desktop applications, XAML Islands is a good path forwards to updating and modernizing their UI. And we get tons of feedback all the time about performance issues with WPF XAML and things like that. But WinUI is a native, much more performant UI and modern framework that you can then go ahead and use to essentially make a beautiful WPF application using the default platform styling rather than having to do tons and tons of resource dictionary editing, which I'm sure WPF developers love doing.
Yeah. I can tell you, actually, I'd really forgotten how much default styling I had to do in a WPF app just to get it looking something half reasonable.
Yeah.
You know, I went back and went, okay, we've got all this stuff. I want to play around with XAML Islands a little bit. And then I went, oh, goodness gracious me. I've got to go and find all my resource dictionaries for all the look and feel and all that sort of stuff and bring it back in.
You got to add a label to every text box. You're like, oh, my gosh.
I know. It's like, oh, UWP XAML, it's the best.
Yeah, yes. It's funny. We don't call it that. It's Windows XAML. Is that right?
WinUI.
WinUI. So WinUI, now, though, when we talk about WinUI, we're really talking about a NuGet package that I can add to my project. Yeah, all right.
Yeah,
yes. Sure.
It's like,
I want to make sure I'm saying it right for you. Well, actually, let's back up.
The library is in a NuGet package.
What is WinUI?
It's a library is the way I would describe it. So it's a UI framework library built by Windows where they are effectively decoupling the platform UI stack from Windows and shipping it as a library for Windows developers. And again, this is kind of along the whole theme of making it so that the best of Windows platform capabilities are available to all Windows developers. By breaking out more and more of these components and shipping them as libraries, it's a lot easier for those developers to consume them. And so that's how I would describe it, but you can go to aka.ms/WinUI and you'll get to their GitHub repository and you can see how they would describe it. They probably say something
I'll take
different.
Your description is perfect, and it has a bunch of benefits too. If your organization is still stuck on Fall Creators Update for whatever reason, you might think as a developer that a lot of the enhancements that have been made to the UI that they're just out of your reach for a long time until you finally upgrade. WinUI kind of gives you a lot of options.
Yeah, WinUI is one of their goals is to go further back in earlier versions of Windows 10 until pretty much most Windows devices can run the WinUI code. So
it does bring a few challenges, though, doesn't it? And I'm sure it's something that on your tooling side of the house, perhaps you're working towards addressing, because it does bring with it a namespace change, doesn't it?
Yes. So instead of Windows.ui.xaml, it's Microsoft.ui.xaml is the namespace. We're still figuring out the exact best way to solve some of these challenges. For the XAML Islands case, it's not quite as challenging because they're adding new functionality and new controls. For a UWP application that wants to shift from using the platform-specific controls to the WinUI controls, that's where it gets more challenging because you essentially have almost identical APIs just with a different namespace.
Yeah.
Daniel, what about a greenfield developer today working in the enterprise? They're going to come to you and they're going to say, what should I choose? What should I do? There's a lot of options here. I know I can choose anything because everything's available, but what do you recommend?
That is a great question. And what I would recommend is to pick the right tool for their job. So I would have to ask a bunch of follow-up questions.
All right, go ahead.
To really understand. Does your application need to interact with any sort of devices that have device driver dependencies?
Let's go with yes.
Okay, who's producing those device driver dependencies and what sort of platforms do they support with their libraries? Like, do they have new UWP specific libraries? Can they have those, or are they .NET Framework libraries? So
if they're .NET Framework libraries, then
or even like native. Most of them are typically like native C++ DLLs, and the way to interact with them is pinvoke into those libraries. And so with that, I would, assuming you have that type of driver dependency, I'd probably recommend like a .NET Core desktop application.
Got it.
And then if you wanted the modern UI and the modern look and feel, you could essentially leverage XAML Islands at essentially a page level and construct custom XAML Islands controls And then you would essentially have the UWP look and feel, but the capabilities and the functionality of pinvoke and .NET Core to access the capabilities in those driver dependencies.
All right, that's good, actually. All right, let's back up, and
Sure.
I'm going to say no. We don't use native drivers. In fact,
right.
it's just a mortgage handling application with SQL on the back end.
We should be dynamically building a decision tree and displaying it as we go.
Yeah, it'd be fun. It'd be fun.
Where does your application need to run?
Just on the desktop. We all have Windows 10.
Okay, if you all have Windows 10 and you just need it to run on the desktop, UWP is a great solution. What sort of controls do you think your application is primarily going to be driven by? If it's like a mortgage application, it sounds like potentially data grid.
Yep, form controls, data grid, stuff like that.
Yes, so you could use UWP. We have I think in WinUI essentially a resource dictionary that enables a more dense display mode, so you could get more information on the screen. A mortgage application sounds like you would want a lot of UI density. And so I would probably recommend UWP using WinUI primarily for your UI as a greenfield application, followed by that dense resource dictionary display mode.
Let's talk about the dense display for a second, because it's really cool looking. And is the mindset that it is now? There's something in between, right? We have this dense. We have this, I don't want to say older, but the first one that was really big, right? That was, touch-centric is a great way to say it. Then we have the one in the middle that's kind of the new Microsoft standard for out of the box.
Yes.
Which one, if I know it's going to be a mouse only and touch is really not going to be part of our use story, then it is probably dense is a great option for
mouse and keyboard. Dense is great, yes.
If it's going to be touch, though, and this is going to be on the factory floor, then I can fall back to the not dense. What's the opposite of that?
The new Microsoft standard.
Yeah, Microsoft standard.
I would just call it the standard UWP UI styling.
So does the original big honking thumb-based button touching style ship still, or is it now just standard and dense?
It's standard and dense as far as I know in the May 2019 update. If you go to an older version of Windows 10, you'll find the old styling. So.
Yeah. Okay, so if you're building an app and targeting, say, Surface Go that was going to be on the shop floor, then standard, otherwise desktop, you're going to lean towards dense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's right. From an enterprise point of view, if you are looking for things that maybe are controls that you've already built or controls that you are have already purchased, maybe they're on the WPF stack, we're bringing UWP controls down to everybody else, but it doesn't go the other way.
Correct.
Yeah, I think that's an important part of it as well. So if you've made an investment in a set of controls.
Yeah, so it's really interesting you mentioned that too, because you've probably seen the new Edge browser. I don't know if you're using the Edge browser. One of the really important enterprise focused scenarios is like a web view hosting in a Windows desktop application. And so I'm not exactly sure how the platform plans to solve this. I know they're actively working on it, but hosting a new modern Edge web view based content in a UWP control is effectively what you just described.
Yeah.
Because it is a Win32 application and you're hosting that Win32 UI content in a UWP application to get that web view rendering. Because
unlike Edge that's alive today, what do you call that? Original Edge? Standard Edge?
Production Edge?
Production Edge?
Sure.
And you know what I mean?
Yes.
That's a UWP app.
Yes, that is a UWP app. So UWP hosting content in a UWP app is easy.
Yeah, but they can't build it as UWP app because now they've made all these promises of moving it over to the Mac. So they got all these things we've got to do.
I'm running on the Mac.
Yeah.
Are you really?
Yeah.
Oh, pretty good.
Oh, it's awesome. It really is.
The new Edge, I use it all the time. Me too. It's wonderful. So I think we'll probably won't platformize that if that's a word, unless we hear substantial customer feedback that this is something that people really, really need. Again, it's a cost, I think, for the web view case. There's probably a certain set of UI capabilities and APIs that need to be exposed, but if we were to make it a more generic, it's probably going to be a bigger API surface and it's going to require more servicing and support and things like that. But if that is something that customers really need because of some critical scenario, please let us know. We have tons of GitHub repositories where we're engaging with the Windows developer community, and that would be a really interesting issue to have a discussion on.
Well, and if you bring a control like that up into UWP, and now you have a UWP you want to redeploy into HoloLens, you got a brand new set of constraints you have to introduce.
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
So talking about those various patterns of applications and so on and so forth, one of the tools that I've seen out there is Template Studio. How engaged are you and your team in Template Studio?
we love working with the Windows Template Studio team. We you may have seen recently in Visual Studio that we've been changing up the way the getting started experience looks and flows and things like that. We had some discussions in the past about bringing Template Studio into Visual Studio itself, but there were a couple of things that prevented that. Primarily, a lot of churn in the getting started experiences and what we're trying to standardize as a product on wizards and things like that. But yeah, we love working with Windows Template Studio. We learn from them all the time about what they're doing and how they're providing solutions for customers. If anyone's actually building a greenfield UWP application, I would always recommend starting with Windows Template Studio. I don't think there's any reason to just write all of that boilerplate code to get started when you could just start from a really great place.
Well, I could think of a reason if you're paid by the hour.
There you go.
Exactly.
That's fair. Then you can, I don't know.
2 weeks later, you're still working on app loaded.
That's right.
Yeah.
Suspend.
Exactly.
That's right. That's great.
Or you could use Windows Template Studio, generate your template, and just wait for the massive commit and go on a 2-week vacation, come back, and hey, look what I did.
Yeah, exactly. If you're paid by the line,
There you go.
well, that is worth it all the way around. I think it's important that, especially XAML developers who anticipate a change in the designer coming so that it finally is in parity with a running application, understand that design time data really is going to probably be the way it is today for a long time.
Yeah, so one of the things, for our XAML designer with UWP, you notice we rebuilt the XAML designer.
Yeah.
We're redoing the same thing for WPF on .NET Core for very similar reasons, and we're also doing it for WinForms. And the motivator for that is primarily runtime compatibility. You can consume .NET Framework components in .NET Core with limited compatibility. We support that scenario, but we do not support the opposite. So trying to load in a .NET Core assembly in a .NET Framework process won't work. And so effectively what we need to do now is all of our design tooling needs to be out of process because it's all running a .NET Core UI application basically. Yeah. And so we're rethinking some of our UI tooling story and kind of holistic strategy with like what is the typical developer UI workflow from using the designer maybe for prototyping, layout generation, or do people do really like specific pixel perfection operations with the designer? I feel like that's typically difficult to do because you don't have that actual runtime operating conditions on a real device or the device that you expect your application to run on. And so for design time data, one of the things we're looking to is our friends in Xamarin. They recently implemented something slightly different where you can essentially just do inline design time data, which solves many cases for when you would need it, especially for the more prototype scenario of the designer. Yeah. So if you're looking for full fidelity UI on the designer, it might be a little harder to write all that design time data inline. But if you just want to see where things look and like where the controls are, maybe you put the control name in the design time data, that works great. So as we rebuild many of these tools, we're trying to figure out the best way to do them rather than just always rebuild what we've already had in the past. Mm-hmm. That said, our kind of guiding philosophy is to meet customer expectations, and WPF developers in particular do have a set of expectations for what will the designer do. And we
what they've been doing for a decade.
Yeah. Right. And so
oh my gosh, and I do not envy you rewriting the WinForms designer. Think of the pressure, man.
Fortunately, that's one of our partner teams in the .NET, so they have been working extremely hard. And that is, customers, I would say, have a much higher expectation of what they can do with the WinForms designer for their application than with WPF. I think very few people write any UI code in WinForms, whereas a lot of people write XAML in WPF.
Yeah, it's very interesting if you think about it, because we have this expectation probably started from Windows Forms, which is 100% fidelity, and that was obviously achieved by running the Windows form and then scraping and dropping that UI into the surface. Yep. And obviously, as you say, we've got now all of these different runtimes, so now we've got to take them out of process. We've got to marshal the bitmap backwards and forwards. We've got to put a layer on top to stop UI clicks going into the underlying controls and all this sort of stuff.
Well, they're still trying to actually run the form in Visual Studio basically as a separate process. So I don't think it'll be like rendering bitmaps and sending that back and forth. It'll be running the process. The challenge is more hosting all of the design tooling in the process of the designer and like communicating with Visual Studio for that.
Yeah.
So that's the big challenge.
That's a headache.
Now, Daniel, we're almost out of time. Quick, ask him about Blend.
I've got to ask you about Blend, apparently.
Yeah, so
I mean, they just want to know, man. They just want to know.
Yeah, I mean, Blend is obviously not going away. We're still supporting everything that we're doing in Blend. I think it was 4 or 5 years ago at this point, we essentially put Blend into the Visual Studio shell so that you can do more of the developer operations in Blend. So everything we do in VS is coming to Blend. We are, again, looking at what is kind of the best way for developers to build UIs and seeing if we can do some of those things in Blend. So obviously visual states and animations are probably two of the most common use cases for Blend. Those will still be supported. Don't worry. You'll still have your assets pane. But
this entire episode was getting to that question.
There you go.
And he didn't want to ask it.
Yes. Well, it's funny, too, as we've been working more closely with the Xamarin team, we hear feedback from Xamarin developers asking for Blend support and things like that. So, yeah, as you alluded to earlier, we are hiring, and one of the things we'll be looking at is end-to-end developer productivity expectations from a UI to productivity tooling. For example, one of the research efforts we just started recently was MVVM development, because we have a long-standing user voice request to actually integrate MVVM into Visual Studio. So we're seeing what that even means. But Blend will
still miss Sketch.
It means model, view, model.
I still miss the Sketch
from a tooling standpoint.
Oh yeah.
What
was that called? Sketchbook? Sketch? What was that called? The thing where you prototype?
Yeah.
Sketchflow.
Sketchflow. Man, it's been that long.
I know.
I miss Light Switch.
Yeah. So, was that even in color?
Oh wait,
yeah.
I got one more question, Daniel. While I got you here, so this is really pinning you against the wall. A couple of developers are still talking to me about the inevitability of XAML standard. Let me just end it there and see what you say.
Yeah. So XAML standard was essentially originally designed to be kind of a specification for syntax alignment. It wasn't supposed to be like a write once, run anywhere XAML framework.
Yeah.
I guess
standard in a way.
Yeah, and and it's funny. We still have work to do in making XAML easier to transfer from WPF to Xamarin Forms and to WinUI. Depending on where the platform moves, though, if WinUI becomes this thing that's the UI library for all of Windows going forwards, then that might be like quote the standard. I don't know. That's a good question. We know the pain is there. We've acknowledged that pain. We don't have.
I think it's fair to say we could stop using the word XAML standard, but it would be nice if it was more standardized. We can all kind of agree.
And it's funny you mentioned that. So I was talking to some of the folks from the Xamarin team, since our team recently kind of merged PM teams with the Xamarin team, and I guess the reason that their syntax is so different is apparently they were afraid of litigation if they copied all of the control names from WPF or UWP, and so they made their own. So they have entry instead of text box, and they have all these other things. So which is funny.
We reap what we sow.
I tell you what, Daniel, I wish you could be in charge of everything for just a week. You'd straighten all this out.
That would be a very stressful week, I feel like.
A lot of expectations. It's heavy.
Yes.
That's right.
But it would be fun.
It would be a good time.
Well, we are trying. I feel like, especially the .NET Core work and the .NET 5 work for Windows developers has generated a lot of positive community response. And it's a good indicator that I feel like we're doing right by developers, which makes me happy. It's what drives me.
I'm really excited for that, seeing the best of the mono runtime, the Java interop and all that coming into play, bringing all of the core cross-platform capabilities and bringing the rest of the legacy from the framework across, the best bits and so on and so forth. I think it was such the right decision, and I think it's being positioned perfectly. And also, I think having that predictable cadence of release, November, I think that helps give people who want a speedier release some satisfaction. They know where it's going to go and the frequency of updates, but it also gives the enterprise the opportunity to plan and pick a long-term support version and stick with that and so on and so forth. So I think it's really addressing the best of both worlds.
And wasn't but 5 years ago when I'd say the temperament around Windows development was really like a frustrating one. It's like, what is Microsoft even saying to us? And that was when you came on. I don't know if it's because of you, but boy, that is totally different now, right? I mean, there's life breathed back into it, back into WinForms and WPF and all, and even UWP is given a real place. And I feel like a lot of developers feel like, I feel like they've been heard. I feel like their career is not, in a bad place anymore. Like all the things they've invested in are paying off, and there's a future they can actually sort of paint and see that we've kind of made through your team and all the other work that's going on really clear to them?
I think it's just coalesce one simple message. It's the desktop stupid.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Yeah. And I mean, if you think
That's
about
not
all
the
form
official
factors
message.
too, yeah, we still have UWP for all platform, all device families. And you talk about like the UWP developer too. I mean, you think about who was the developer that adopted UWP from the very beginning. They're the cutting edge, bleeding edge developer, and they probably experienced frustration where they built applications that took advantage of capabilities that not very many of their customers could take advantage of because they aren't updating on day one like they are probably. And so I think a lot of the efforts we're doing to bring a lot of those platform capabilities to earlier versions of Windows 10 is really going to make it so that UWP developer can now update their WinUI library package. And great, now all of the customers can use it rather than only the 10% of customers that updated on day one of Windows 10 releases.
Exactly. Finally having reach, I think, is key.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
There's a lot of goodness. Well, listen, man, thanks for coming on the show. I love talking about XAML, love talking about Windows development,
anytime.
and I love having. I can't believe we haven't had you on the show till now. So, Daniel, thanks for christening this episode.
Of course, it's my pleasure. Thanks, Daren. Thanks, Sherry.
All right,
Have
we'll
a great
see you
day.
again.